Uh, Hello, everyone. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Vijay Balasubramanian, who will kick off our senior summer school. Vijay has a very interesting scientific career. He is a physics professor at the University of Pennsylvania working on superstring theory, the fundamental nature of space-time, the information paradox problem in the presence of a black hole, which I heard recently there's a breakthrough, right? As a neuroscientist, he is working on very interesting sensory coding problems, such as the origins of place cells and grid cells, namely the representation of space-time in a biological mind. So it is quite amazing that one can do both things in the same office. It reminds me of the beloved character in the Big Bang Theory, Sheldon Cooper, and his girlfriend, Amy Poehler, but in one person. So without further delay, let us welcome Vijay.
Thanks. That was a lovely introduction. Thank you so much. I should tell my mother. Should be happy. So thanks very much for inviting me to lecture in the summer school. I can only wish that it was possible to do it in person. The last time I was at Tsinghua was a really wonderful visit, so I wish I was there again. Also, last time I was at USTC. I think, Chuan, you're at USTC. That was a wonderful visit, so I would wish I was there again. Anyway, so let me start by, sorry? Yeah, so let me start by sharing my screen. So there we go, there's my, so do let me know whether you can now see my screen. This should be, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Which one?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great, wonderful. So as per the instructions of the organizers, my lectures are divided into two parts. So today I will deliver the first part, the basic lecture, as a prelude to the advanced lecture that I will give in a week or so. So the topic of my lecture today is principles of distributed computation in the brain. So I think before I start, I should sort of explain the philosophy of this lecture. So first of all, it's the first lecture in the school. So I'm going to explain some basics and set up some questions that I think are interesting to answer. Personally, when I went to summer schools, one of the things I found most useful is lists of questions that people were interested in and what new ideas I could do, and less interesting was what people had done before. So a lot of things I'll say, so I'll say many things which I wish I knew how to answer, but I don't. And maybe one of you who are the next generation of scientists will be able to answer these questions using new techniques you've invented. Anyway, so let's start with the lecture, Principles of Distributed Computation in the Brain. So as everybody in this audience knows, the brain, like every other bit of your body, is made of cells, but by special cells, neurons. And neurons, as you know, have this special structure. They have an anatomy designed for communication and computation. They have these input wires, dendrites, and an output wire, the axon, over which a signal travels to the next neuron. As everybody here also knows, the great thing about neurons is they've used the electrical capacities of cells that harness them to become circuit elements. And they do that by taking, when there's an input neurotransmitter release at the dendrites, the voltage of the cell rises from minus 70 millivolts very rapidly to a peak and then comes back down, goes back. These action potentials are the bulk of the communication done by the brain. Much of the communication computation is through these digital pulses as opposed to some sort of analog changes in potential and so on. Indeed, this fact was discovered in the late even 18th century and early 19th century when people were, when people like Volta built the first batteries and people stuck the batteries into things like frogs' legs and watched them kick. And initially, people thought that life itself was somehow driven by electricity and tried to do things like reanimate, dead people and dead creatures by just pumping them full of electricity, watching the bodies move. But now we know that the only reason those things happen is because neurons, will fire muscles. And so by sort of making neurons fire, you can give the appearance of a thing being alive by making it move. Well, but single neurons, as you know, can't do much. They can't write poetry. They can't climb buildings. So to actually produce the bulk of the behavior that we value or find interesting in animals, you need something more complicated, something like a brain, or at least a very large nerve net. And It's the collective behavior of lots and lots of neurons together in these gigantic collections that produce the effect that produce animal behavior. So at the largest scale, if I look at how the computation is organized, you could have imagined that neurons just collected together into some very gigantic kind of neural network, in the language of computer science, some kind of deep network of some very complicated variety, and in some holistic manner, all the functions of the brain would just emerge. But that's definitely not the case. So if you look at the brain, if I look at this here, let me try to turn off this thing here. Is there some way for me to hide this meeting controls? There we go. Great. So if I look at the whole brain, as you know, in the back here, you have the visual cortex. So functions, the circuits associated with vision are segregated and at the back of the head. Here are the speech areas like Broca's area that control your ability to produce speech. The motor control areas here running down the side of your head, and in the front here in your prefrontal cortex are all the functions that are associated, the circuits that control functions associated with things like behavior, personality, planning, and so on. This is why, of course, if someone offers you a lobotomy, which is to say they offer to scramble your frontal cortex in order to cure some problem that you're having, you should decline, because you won't be the same person, because a lot of the circuits in the front of your head there encode much of what we value in human behavior. Now, we've known this segregation of function, this distribution of computation in the brain, also for a long time. So there's a papyrus from ancient Egypt in which the author describes how he has patients who have damage to one piece of their head, another piece of their head, and they lose one function, but not other functions. So this way we've known that the computational functions that are important for animal behavior are distributed in this way. It's not one holistic neural network, never has been. But in the modern period, this realization came first through the work of Dr. Broca in France. He had a patient who had damage to this piece of the head right there, where I'm pointing my pointer. That's now called Broca's area, because this patient was unable to produce coherent speech for the rest of their life, but this person was able to do everything else perfectly well. So we've known since then that there's this segregation of function. But if you look at any one of these given areas, for example, the motor control area, and look a little bit closer, focus in some more, once again, you find it's not that the motor control is in some gigantic, neural network, something like a deep network that collectively controls the body. Rather, the circuits that control the knee are up at the top. The circuits that control the fingers are down at the side. And over here are the circuits that control your face. In other words, even if you take something specific like motor control, the computational function is distributed across this area, and there are specific circuits that do different things. So, of course, it's not that they sort of sit around and work on things separately. So in my second lecture, I'm going to talk about the circuits that underlie our sense of space, how we process and plan and navigate and so on. So those circuits are collected into a bunch of different brain areas like the ones I illustrated, and they all communicate with each other. So for example, the sensory input that builds your sense of space comes into this whole big circuit from the perirhinal and post-rhinal area. Your movement input, with which you do path integration, comes from the pre and parasubiculum, the retrosplenial cortex. And these inputs come into two areas, the lateral and the medial entorhinal cortex. These things feed, construct representations and compute things like the content of the world, the items and the events and what's there and where it is. The medial entorhinal cortex includes construction of a spatial map in terms of the grid cells. And that data is then transmitted to a variety of areas associated with the hippocampus, CA1, CA2, CA3, and the dentate gyrus. And these things do, association, attractor dynamics, pattern separation, all manner of things. And then they feed right back. So this highly structured circuit that looks like a flow diagram of procedures in a computer program is what's being done in the head to produce your sense of space. So I view my job as understanding the logic of circuits like this and how they produce, for example, our spatial imagination, or indeed any other thing that we do. This is not some general purpose, neural network or indeed a general purpose computer. It's some specific circuit with the logical functions involved, the procedures involved, the computation separated out in some interesting way. And the theorist should be able to answer the question, why it's this way, not some other way. Is this a useful way to organize these computations? Is it not a useful way? And we should be able to understand these things, thinking like a computer scientist. Now, actually, at this level of analysis is even not complete. So if you look at any one of those little areas, any given brain area, and here we're looking at the particular brain area called the retina, and a drawing by Ramon y Cajal from 1917, even within one little area, the computation is organized in a distributed way, in distributed microcircuits. So here we have the retina, and the first layer there, you have the photoreceptors. In the second layer, you have, the so-called bipolar cells. And the third layer are the ganglion cells, whose outputs, the output axons form the optic nerve bundle. Now, already you see that the retina is not like a CCD camera, right? It's a 3-layer neural network with, 3 different kinds of cells at least. But actually, if we look at this output layer, there are at least 20 different kinds of parallel output channels, right? So these are feature detectors of different kinds. Some of these things detect spots that are bright, some detect spots that are dark, some detect, little motions from left to right, some detect right to left, some detect color, so all of these different kinds of visual features are what's being computed here. So this is like a little special purpose computer that's taking the visual input and then breaking it up into useful pieces for further processing by the brain. Even this is not detailed enough. If you look at our modern understanding, Cajal's drawing is a cartoon. By now, we know there are at least 60 different kinds of cells. It's crazy, right? So there's the photoreceptors, the bipolar cells, and the ganglion cells that we talked about. But what is more, there are 2 kinds of so-called horizontal cells. These are interneurons that are inhibitory, and at least 30 different kinds of interneurons between the bipolar cell layer and the ganglion cell layer. And all of these do crazy things. In biology, there's a rule that form follows function, and these things all look different, so you can bet that they do different, and indeed they do. These diverse interneurons are the computational engine of the retina. These things are doing all the different kinds of computations that allow you to piece the world apart into its visual features. And what's more, it's not like this is a random circuit where everything is connected to everything in some crazy way and through learning they sort it out. Indeed, if you look at every vertebrate retina, you'll find that the slow bipolar cell in this second layer will communicate with a local ED cell in the output layer, and the fast bipolar cell here in the second layer will communicate with the so-called brisk transient cell in the output layer. So this is a highly structured circuit whose logic we would like to understand. Of course, one reason to understand logic is because if we did, it's a good thing. It's a good thing to understand how the brain works. Another reason to understand the circuit is if you knew exactly how it worked, there's no reason why you couldn't build a circuit in silicon and just replace it if someone loses their eye. So these are clearly extraordinarily important problems. However, this kind of immense diversity raises a question for me, right? So the first thing I'd like to point out is the insane diversity of circuit elements. Why do you need this? So that's one of my questions that I would like to ask you. It's something I've been struggling with ever since I entered this field. If you take a computer science theory class, they will tell you that you can build an arbitrary computer, doing anything. You can build an arbitrary computer using one kind of logic gate. You just need a NAND gate, not AND. And by stringing NAND gates together in a sufficiently Baroque way, you can do any computation. So why would you have this insane number of types of cells organized in the computation distributed way in just the retina? And then you've got all of these different kinds of little areas that talk to each other in complicated ways, in some hierarchical way. They build an even more complicated circuit. It's just all insanely diverse. So why is this happening? Is a question that I would love to be able to answer. Now, I'd like to emphasize that in the analogy with computers that we make all the time about the brain, the brain really doesn't look like a traditional computer architecture. It does not look like the von Neumann architecture. So the von Neumann architecture, the way things usually work, is you have the inputs. The inputs feed into a central processing unit. the central processing unit has some control and some arithmetic and logic units and stuff. It can talk back and forth with memory. Memory is a very useful thing to have. And then it produces output. So that's the sort of gross structure of a traditional computer. So usually when you actually, if you buy the parts and assemble the computer itself, you have a CPU, a memory, and an input and output, and all three of them talk with what's called a control bus, an address bus, and data bus, and this allows the information to pass back and forth. So these are wires carrying all the information, and then the CPU, the memory, and the input and output can read through that. The brain just does not look like this. So it's clearly a different principles of computation are acting. The brain looks much more distributed than this. This looks very centralized. Now, on the other hand, the brain is also not a deep neural network. So, it's very fashionable these days to say, oh yeah, deep neural networks, deep learning has basically solved, everything, and we can do any sort of computation. But look, the basic deep neural network has the following character. There's some inputs, they feed into some intermediate units. The intermediate units, take the inputs and, do some slightly nonlinear computation. They feed the outputs to an output layer, and then out comes the messages. Right,
there's
if you
a
want
question
to get more
on the chat room.
Sure.
So in computers, there are CPUs, GPUs, etc. Clusters have more parts. Why it is not distributed? I think the question,
I don't understand the question actually.
The question is it? I think Yuri is asking. You think the computer is also a distributed circuit, right? So it's just
not in the same way. Not in the same way. So if you have a CPU and a GPU, the CPU and the GPU are both centralized processing units that do general purpose computation based upon a very general instruction set. If you have a cluster with multiple cores, the multiple units, it's identical units doing identical things, and then you can instruct it to do some different kinds of calculations by sending them different kinds of instructions. But really, it's clusters typically of identical units organized in different ways. So it's not distributed in the same sense that you have in the brain different regions that are specialized to this computation or that computation or third computation. They do not have the capacity. If you the hippocampus doesn't do, edge detection. The edge detection is done by the visual cortex. There are all of these specialized functions that are distributed about, right? So that certainly seems to me very different from what we would call distributed computation. If you make 10 cores and then you take your program then separates out what you want to do in every core. That doesn't seem to me at all the same kind of hardware architecture. So I hope that answered the question. So then moving on to this kind of architecture, apparently not, because there's a question in the chat box. Oh, thanks for clarification. I did answer the question. Good. So then the other thing I'd like to say is that it's extremely fashionable in neuroscience right now to apply deep learning to everything. It's the canonical model people would like to apply. There's some input, you run a deep network, there's an output, you do something, and you try to interpret the intermediate layers in terms of the structure of the brain. So roughly speaking, the idea is there's an input layer, hidden layer, hidden layer, hidden layer, an output layer, like this. And then, you train it and you break apart the intermediate layers. So the brain definitely doesn't look like this either. Right? It's not the case that you have random connections or global connections between each of the layers. It's also not the case that you don't have 50 layers or 100 layers. You have between the eye and the inferior temporal cortex, where you can recognize faces, that are about 6 layers. You don't need as many examples to learn things, right? You can remember a face after seeing an example. You don't need hundreds of examples of the faces. And this is, I showed pictures of what the brain circuit looks like before. It's looking, again, the issue here is that deep networks are general purpose learning engines. Right? You can train them, given the architecture, you can train them to do many different things, whereas the brain is clearly a special purpose, or looks like a special purpose learning engine. It does certain things and apparently does them well, but it's not designed to learn anything in this kind of sense. So there's something different about it compared to this architecture, at least in my opinion. So what do we want to say? So if I go back to the drawing board and ask myself, I'm supposed to be doing computational neuroscience, so what is computation in the first place? Well, clearly computation involves a transformation of information between different forms. Somehow it involves making implicit information explicit, because the information you wanted might have been there in the input, but not sort of in an obvious way. It may have been implicitly distributed, and you want to extract and make it explicit. So, computation often involves extraction of facts or features or useful information, useful for your behavior, of course. In other words, information that is relevant for other goals and tasks and computations, right? And so typically when you think of a computation, there's a unit that takes in inputs from the same or different units, upstream units, and then does some calculation and sends the outputs to different places. So who reads the computation in the brain? Well, one of the difficulties of thinking about this, as compared to, thinking about deep networks or about von Neumann architectures, is it's as if, when you look in the brain and you look at any given brain area, it's a little computer in its own right. It's taking some inputs, it's doing some transformation, producing some outputs. But at each scale, if this is like, for example, a brain area, the results of the computation are read by other components of the same scale and also by components at a different scale. So you have this sort of architecture where from the single neuron to the whole brain, you have these units that do a computation, send messages amongst each other, and then send messages to different scales too. And as a result, it's as if each of these modules must have kind of, if you like, a defined interface with other units. So they have to be able to know what each other is doing. And to make matters even more complicated, all of these circuits have to be able to reorganize through learning. So since it's a network that's not centrally controlled, anytime there's a change of task or there's some learning or your goals change, this whole system has to reorganize itself and communicate in a different way, and has to do that without a centralized instruction that tells what all of these units must do. So, the larger scale goal of my research has been to try to understand these overall features of the structure of computation in the brain. So, but every time I think about this, I keep coming back to this question of structure versus randomness in these circuits. So, as many of you will know, a powerful and popular model of cortical computation basically thinks about cortex as a random balanced network. So you think about it as a random network, and then you think about random networks as being capable of doing many different computations, and then external signals selecting one computation of the other. Right? Machine learning is like that too, as we were saying. You have a general network that's unstructured, and then you learn how to adapt to specific tasks or switch the architecture to specific tasks. But again, I'd like to emphasize again that this is not the way the brain looks. So for example, if I look at the auditory cortex, then you see that this is it's just highly structured. So you have the excitatory neurons, the pyramidal cells, and they get input from the sensory thalamus. And then what they have is they have two kinds of inhibitory neurons, the SOM neurons, somatostatin positive neurons, and the PV neurons that have very structured motifs. The PV neurons inhibit the excitatory neurons, the pyramidal cells, proximally to the cell body, and the somatostatin positive cells, the SOM cells, inhibit the pyramidal cells, distally to the cell body. Then all of these have recurrence. They have, when you look at them, they have recurrent ways of exciting or inhibiting themselves. And then it turns out there's another kind of inhibitory neuron, the VIP neuron, and the VIP neuron inhibits both of these other inhibitory neurons. And what's more, they inhibit each other, and then, it just sort of goes on like this. And this kind of motif, this circuit motif, keeps recurring, right, throughout the cortex. So what's this for? It's clearly not a random network with everybody connected to everybody. In particular, for example, if you look at the inputs to this inhibitory neuron, they come from the amygdala, which is involved in things like emotion, so like fear conditioning. So you could well imagine that this VIP neuron is involved with tweaking what the cortex does. It's a knob to change what the cortex does based upon your experience of the world, including fear. So none of this has been entirely understood. So we don't understand this at the computation level at all, right? So we can do this scale by scale. So on the one hand, I drew this at the scale of single neurons, but I could draw this at the scale of this larger bunch of areas that are talking to each other in order to produce spatial cognition. So at every scale, I'm trying to emphasize that there are these highly structured representations, these highly structured computational motifs. And our goal in the field should be really to understand the principles that underlie the structuring of these circuits at every scale, right? Why are they that way? And we need to think like computer scientists to understand that. So with that introduction, what questions could we pose? So a question that animates me is, first of all, why does the brain distribute computation? Especially in light of deep learning, I might have thought that you could instead structure a very broad, broadly connected network and then learn whatever I need to do. Why is it so structured? Likewise, what organizational principles organize these distributed circuits at each scale? So the approach I've tried to take to these kinds of questions is to view the circuit repertoire in the brain as a memory of the computations that have predictive value for behavior that are learned over evolutionary time and then encoded in the genome of the developmental program. So what principles then might control this circuit repertoire, right? So one idea might be that you have this diverse and distributed architecture to promote computational flexibility. That is to say, so suppose you want to have, as I was saying, when you change your goals, when you want to do a different thing, you want to recruit the different functions, the different bits of the or procedures in different ways. So when you write a program, if you write separate procedures to do logically separate things, it's a useful thing, because then you can call this procedure and this procedure to do task A, and that procedure and some other procedure to do task B. So it could be, so one idea would be that the driving principle for this distributed organization is computational flexibility. A second idea is computational robustness. So for example, in such a distributed architecture, there may be multiple ways of doing the same task. That could be useful. If for some reason there's damage or something is blocked here, you could use that pathway instead. A third idea for why you would get such a distributed organization is computational evolvability. That is to say, all our brains evolved from whatever nerve net or single few neuron systems existed in the primordial worms and creatures of that sort. So to evolve, how would you evolve a brain? Well, a standard way of thinking about how you evolve new functions is there some mutation that causes you double, repeat a structure you already had. You make a copy. Then you don't need the second copy because the first copy is doing the thing you needed it for in the first place. So the second copy is free to drift and do something else. And eventually it just finds something useful and gets selected for. That's a standard way people think in evolution. So it could be that that's why you have all of this highly distributed architecture. It's that's the search path that the system has from the primordial organisms to now. So that's yet another idea. So two more ideas that have been very popular in theoretical neuroscience are the ideas of computational efficiency and computational cost. The idea in those approaches is that there are many things about the structure of neural circuits that can be understood by saying that the circuits in the brain have been selected to be computationally efficient and to minimize appropriate computational costs. So in many ways, that is the formulation that's the easiest to write down in equations and to really investigate. So there's been a lot of work on that. So because of this, and especially because these are the first lectures in this course, I will focus on those 2 points today and develop from there. Okay, so on the idea of computational efficiency and driving down computational cost as being driving principles that produce this kind of distributed organization of computation in the brain. So that's what I'm going to go after. Okay, so what kind of costs might be relevant if you think about efficiency? Well, one thing you might think about is that, the brain this is the thing inside your head, is 2% of your body weight, but it's fully 20% of your metabolic load. So in other words, it's 10 times more expensive than muscle when you're working out. This is a seriously expensive organ to own. On the other hand, your brain consumes just 12 to 20 watts of power. So it's very, very cheap. If I think about my laptop, for example, it's 80 watts. So compared to my laptop, it's an insanely cheap computational device to own, right? So you could ask, well, that's on the one hand, it seems expensive. On the other hand, it seems very efficient compared to my laptop. How does the brain achieve its efficiency? Well, I'm going to try to pursue the idea that one way of achieving this kind of efficiency is by specializing your computations. So the idea here is that, if you think about in many fields, like, for example, economics and sociology, when they talk about the development of human civilizations, people will say things like, back in the day, everybody used to hunt the animals and dig the ground and build the houses. But then as civilization progresses, people specialize. one person builds the houses and become very good at that and become efficient at that, and somebody else hunts the animals and becomes efficient at that. And in this way, by segregating the functions into different units, in that case in the society, the whole society achieves a greater efficiency. So in a like manner, that's essentially an economic argument. So we're going to try to make a similar economic argument involving the consumption of, say, power or the cost of computation, and then argue from that it will drive a segregated, distributed organization. So in case you would like to understand the energy budgets of the brain in detail, there's some very nice papers by Atwell and Laughlin from about 20 years ago, and Lenny, and a very recent paper by Levy and Calvert and PNAS, in which they, in a very detailed biophysical way, piece apart all the different processes involved biophysically in a neuron computing and communicating information. And they come to the conclusion, these authors, that neural spiking and communication is the dominant cost in what the brain does. So it's an extremely expensive thing to do. So you might definitely think that algorithms and architectures, computational architectures that reduce the cost, the ATP cost of operating the brain, would be a good thing, would be selected for over time. So that leads us to principle one. We're going to investigate the idea that brains exploit the average structure of the world to efficiently allocate their limited computational communication resources to maximize gain for the organism. So we're going to take that point of view and try to see how far we can go towards explaining things about the distributed architecture of computation. So that's going to be the agenda in today's lecture and the next lecture. Of course, there is a second principle that's operating at the same time, that neural circuits also self-organize their architecture through dynamics and learning. So we're not going to talk much about that in today's lecture, but we will in the second lecture, because all of these circuits, they're not static. They adapt to ongoing variations in the world around their average structure. They learn new tasks, and they correct inaccuracies in pre-existing dynamics, like the brain on the left here is doing inside that little head. Right, so all of that, we'll discuss more about those kinds of principles in the second lecture. But for today, we would like to have a concrete formalism in which we can try to make some progress about what it would mean to compute efficiently or effectively. So we said earlier that what is computation? Well, computation is a transformation of some signal stream that produces useful information. So to quantify that and to make progress, we have to have some sense of what we want to mean by the word information. There could be many definitions, but for the purposes of this lecture, we'll use the kind of definition due to Claude Shannon and in information theory. So how does that work? Now, let's suppose you have a stream of zeros and ones, spike or no spike in different kinds of time bins. And we're going to, and let's just ask before we try to write down any equations about this, how much information do you get depending upon different patterns of spikes and no spikes, zeros and ones? Suppose the neuron is always silent, so you get 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. Obviously, you don't get any information because every new zero tells you nothing. On the other hand, suppose the neuron is always firing, so you get 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. Well, clearly each new one tells you nothing either, because, well, it was always going to be 1, so there's nothing surprising about that. So that's useless too. Now let's suppose you have a neuron that sometimes sends zeros and sometimes sends 1. Well, you're surprised at each new symbol because you couldn't predict it in advance, is informative. So it tells you something you did not know. So all formulations that try to quantify the amount of information produced by computation somehow try to quantify your notion of surprise. We can go further. It's clear, for example, that if you have a bigger vocabulary, so for example, instead of sending zeros and ones, you send 3 zeros, 2s, and 1s. For example, this could be a neuron that fires in bursts. It fires, 1 spike or 2 spikes or 3 spikes or no spikes. So bigger vocabulary should clearly increase your information. So whatever formula we have should have that property. It's also clear that noise, of course, if you add noise to this, you will lose some information. Another thing that should happen is that correlation should reduce information. Why? So for example, if you have zeros and then you have every once in a while 1, 1, in other words, you always have a doublet of ones, that every time you see a 1, you see a spike, you will see a second spike. So you could replace the 1, 1 with the 1 tilde, indicating that you always get the 1, 1 is the symbol in question. So correlations of that kind also reduce information. So Overall, by looking at that, we immediately see that you'd be most surprised, namely you would learn the most from each symbol if they all appear to be sort of randomly distributed. So in other words, if you have a signal coming in, and then it's encoded and it's sent out as a distribution of zeros and ones that looks statistically uncorrelated, it would appear that you would get the most information out of this. So, and as we will see, a standard technique that's been used in theoretical neuroscience now for about 50 years is to posit that a neural circuit should, in this sense, decorrelate its input, have minimum correlations, and sort of encode things as randomly or independently as possible. And that becomes a theoretical principle for understanding the structure of neural circuits. But to quantify that, what we need to do is to build a formalism that allows us to quantify the informative surprise in a signal. So let's start by imagining we're talking about neurons that fire with zeros or ones, one spike or no spikes, and ask what formula should be used to quantify how much information a neuron is communicating from one place to another place. So what do we want from the formula? So, well, clearly the formula will have to depend on the frequency with which you use different symbols, because, if you use zeros all the time, clearly there's nothing. If you use ones all the time, there's no information, but somewhere in the middle, there should be plenty of information. So suppose we have a measure of surprise. I'm going to call that measure little h. So h of this distribution should be a decreasing function of the probability P of R, since more frequent use of the symbol R would make it less surprising. So it should be some decreasing function of that. Now, suppose you have two independent measurements from two different neurons. Then if you have that, then the probability of what neuron 1 says multiplies the probability of what neuron 2 says to give you the joint distribution over the two neurons. So it seems very reasonable that the amount you learn from two independent neurons that are not talking to each other should sum up, that it should add. So you want the surprise associated with two independent neurons to be the sum of the surprises of the individual ones. So this should be true for any probability distribution P. So that leads to the natural guess. And I'm simply following the logic of Shannon back from the 1950s, that the measure of surprise should be the logarithm, because the logarithm has this additive property that the logarithm of a product is the sum of the logs. So this led Shannon to define a notion that he called the entropy of a distribution, which is the expected value of minus the log of the probability. So that's simply you sum over the symbols, in this case 0 and 1, of the probability of the symbol times the log of the probability of the symbol with a minus sign. And this quantity, which is related to the quantity entropy in physics, is a measure of how much information is being pumped through the signal. So suppose you've got many values R1 let's suppose you can fire one spike or two spikes or three spikes or n spikes. You can fire in little words that have many there are many symbols that you can use to communicate the information. Then by this definition, the entropy or the amount of information conveyed by the signal is the sum on all the symbols of the P of Ri log P of Ri, where P of Ri is the probability of that symbol. So you could ask yourself, how could you design the neuron or the code to send symbols or signals that maximize the amount of information? So if you want to maximize the information, well, you need to take the derivative dH dPi and set it equal to 0, and this should be true for every single symbol Ri. And now, furthermore, since P is a probability distribution, the sum over all the symbols of Pi must be equal to 1. So by symmetry, we expect, because all the symbols are equivalent to each other, we should expect that all the Pi would be equal, and therefore the maximum entropy distribution here would be simply 1 over n. Every symbol occurs with equal probability. So what we've just shown in this very simple case is that the entropy is maximized in the absence of any constraints by the uniform distribution. So we will revisit this in a more realistic setting where there are the kinds of constraints we expect in a neural system later. But this kind of idea has been used before. So for example, famously, Simon Laughlin in the early 1980s used the idea that the information is maximized by having a uniform output distribution to predict the response functions of the large monopolar cells in the fly visual system. So literally what he did is he said, here's the input distribution of light, or contrast rather, to this fly visual system. He assumed that this cell which which responded to contrast in the world, should produce a uniform output distribution from some range to some range of activities. And from that, he was able to use the information theory to build a prediction of how that cell should work. So this is a technique that goes back a long way within the field. Anyway, so this is an example of how you use information optimization to say something about how you should encode a signal. Now, of course, this is not good enough, because in real life, if you're talking about neurons, it's not true that you take the inputs and you send them to the outputs. So first of all, it can happen that so that's a picture where, it's not the situation in the real world that you have, let's say you have 4 inputs, they go into the neuron and they're transmitted exactly as the 4 outputs. Then you don't need a neuron, you just need a wire, right? So more commonly what happens is, first of all, there's noise, so that the same inputs sometimes produces different outputs, right? Neurons are noisy devices. That's one thing that happens. And the dashed lines here are supposed to indicate the noise. And so it's clear that the response has to contain less information than the input because it's being corrupted by noise. Secondly, in general, so suppose you were to consider a visual neuron, for example, the retina, it's just the case that the retinal output has a smaller bandwidth, a smaller expressiveness than the input. So, for example, the light level in the world can vary over, 10 orders of magnitude between noon and dusk. But a given retinal neuron has about 10 different firing rates up to noise. So it can fire 1 hertz, 2 hertz, 3 hertz. There's a certain range, there's a narrow range it can fire over. So it's much more like this, where you have 4 inputs that are compressed into 2 outputs. Again, the output should contain less information than the input. So a meaningful way of using, information theory to evaluate the quality of the computation being done in this channel must include both of these considerations. One is noise, and this fact that the output will have less bandwidth than the input. Just to illustrate in the language of spike trains, so suppose you present the same input multiple times. I'm here drawing a raster plot where I'm drawing the response of one neuron in this case to a repeated input. So this is the first time you repeat it, this is the second repeat, and the third repeat. So it's completely standard when we look at experiments like this, that, maybe in the first repeat in this block, you see 3 spikes, then you see 2 spikes, and you see 2 spikes, and you see 1 spike in the second block, no spike, 1 spike, etc. So it's clear that there's noise, there's trial-to-trial variability, that's noise. And what's more, the output definitely has less bandwidth, dynamic range, than its input. So how do you make precise what it is that how much the output tells you about the input? Well, one technique for doing that, a good technique for doing that, is something called the mutual information. So how does that work? So you do this in 2 ways. So first, clearly, the more expressive or variable the output of the neuron is, the more information it transmits. So what do? You write down the possible outputs of the neuron, R1, R2, R3. So this may be if you're just talking about, you could be spike, no spike, or it could be, if we're looking at little blocks in time, it could be different patterns of spike. Every pattern of spike would be one of these symbols R. And then you write down the probability distribution in your data over all of these different patterns that can be produced by the neuron, right? And the wider this distribution, the bigger the total response repertoire. So if you compute Shannon's entropy for that distribution of responses, all the patterns that the neuron can produce, that's minus the sum on all the possible responses of the probability of the response log probability of the response. This measures the total number of bits of information that are transmitted by the neuron. But we know that some of this information is lost to noise. So how do we quantify the noise? Well, what does noise mean? I give you a given input to the neuron. If the output is variable, then that quantifies noise. So the wider the distribution of responses are given a given input S, the wider this distribution, the more the noise. So a way to quantify how noisy the neuron is you say that the entropy of the response distribution given a stimulus S quantifies the noise entropy given the stimulus S. And then you say that the total noise entropy, the total number of bits of information that you lose to noise, is the expected value of the noise entropy. So you take this HS, which is the entropy or the bits lost to noise if you have the stimulus S, and you average it over all the stimuli, and that quantity gives you the average bits lost to noise. So if I look at a neuron, and it's a little computing device, and it's got some inputs and it's got some outputs, then the total entropy of its outputs computes the total number of bits transmitted, and the noise entropy computes the bits lost to noise. And so in the trade, one defines a thing called the mutual information, which is the bits transmitted minus the bits lost to noise, as simple as that. And here it is. Here is the total entropy. It's you take the response distribution and you compute its entropy minus p log p summed over the responses, and then you compute the average. This is compute the sum on the inputs s times the probability of the inputs, computes the average over inputs times the noise entropy associated with each input. So in other words, it's the response entropy minus the entropy of the response conditioned on the stimulus. So this thing is called the mutual information. Now, you can write this in many ways. So I have sent in, I've sent to the organizers of the school a homework in which you can practice doing these things. So the first part of the homework involves using these expressions for mutual information, manipulating them to get some sense of how they work. And then the second part of the homework involves applying it to spike trains, not real data, but artificial data that you can sort of create in some way, and then to use that to try to understand the properties of this thing. Anyway, so one of the exercises that you'll do will build from this page. So suppose I write down the mathematical expression we wrote down for the mutual information a moment ago. It's minus the total entropy. It's the total entropy minus the noise entropy. So now observe that here I have where is this? Yes, so now I'm going to recall that to get to the final form here, we take the probability of all the different responses, and we write them as a sum on all the inputs of the conditional probability of the response given the input times the probability of the input. This is just simply factorizing the distribution. And after you've done that, you can combine these two terms because P of R is equal to P of S times P of R given S. So then you can combine these two terms and write the whole sum, all of this together, as the sum on the inputs and the outputs of the probability of the input times the probability of the output given the input times this ratio of logs. That's combining this log in the second expression and this log in the first expression. Now, further, we can say, we can take this minus sign here and put it into the log, and that flips the numerator and the denominator. And now finally, we can recall Bayes' rule, which says that the joint probability of R and S is the conditional probability of R given S times probability of S, and it's also equal to the probability of S given R times the probability of R. This means we can combine these two objects, P of S and P of R given S, into the joint distribution. So all told, this is a standard expression here for the mutual information between the input and the output of a channel. It's the sum on the input and the output of the joint distribution of the input and the output times the logarithm of the conditional distribution of the output given the input divided by the probability of the output. So this thing is called the mutual information, and it's the information conveyed by the response about the input. In your homework, you will also show that this is the information conveyed by the input about the output. It's actually symmetric, and it contains, there are various inequalities. This quantity must be less than the entropy or the total number of bits in the input. It must be also less than the entropy or the total number of bits in the output. And these are all very powerful properties that we'll wind up using later, but you'll prove them basically in your homework. So if you want, here's another exercise. Chuan, I wanted to ask you, do you want to pause and give the students a chance to sort of work on this exercise by themselves, or should we pause and take a break? We're at about the halfway mark, and for 10 minutes, and I'll just leave this exercise up, and they can do it on their own time.
Yes, both are good. I think we can leave the exercise here. Yeah, let's take a 10 minutes break. And if you have any questions, the students have any questions, you can ask questions as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
Should I stop sharing the screen?
Yeah, I think we can copy it. I can copy this exercise and I can send it to Slack. You can take a look. And in the
Sure.
meantime, you can stop sharing and we can see everyone's face.
Right.
Yeah. And if you have any questions so far, please ask. Yeah.
Hello, may I ask any question?
Yes.
I can see there are so many types of retinal cells, right? So how do they being categorized? Only by their shapes or also other properties?
That is an excellent question as to how do you conclude that there are many different types. So it used to be that people did that entirely morphologically, that is by shape, and they would say this looks like this looks like this. And what they would do is they would, as they section the cell, they would sort of pull out kind of quantitative markers of the shape and try to sort of cluster them. And always what they would find is, of course, there were these bumps, right, in the shape space, but there was some overlap, so there were always things in the intermediate regions. So a second way of classifying different cell types is functionally. So you present different inputs, you present many inputs, and you ask what do they respond to? And if they respond to different things, or they respond with different patterns, right? If some neurons go brrrr and some go blip, 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 then they're different. So then people try to develop functional classifications of neurons that do different things. And by and large, the functional and anatomical classifications matched. Things that looked different did different. In more modern times, what one can do is classify cell types by what proteins they express. You basically look at the gene expression patterns. And by looking at the transcriptome of the cell, you can see, they're also different. So again, it turns out that the transcriptome-based classification of cell type largely agrees with the morphological and the functional differences. Although, of course, there are always some intermediates, and you scratch your head and wonder, well, is that really there, or is it by confused, or is it just an aberrant cell, or we don't really know. But that was a very good question.
Yeah, thank you.
Maybe we should put people in breakout groups. So since we're experimenting with the format for this thing and it's sort of all online. So one thing that I thought is, usually in my lectures, if I give an exercise like that, what I do is I put people into breakout groups and they can talk amongst themselves, because sometimes people are shy to sort of talk in public, and then they can work on the exercise and come back. That's one idea.
We can do that. We can try the breakout, breakout rooms. How many? We have roughly 20 people, right? Here, I think 27. 5 group. No, not maybe 4 group. 4 group. Yeah. Let me try to.
And so you don't have to answer all those questions, but just to you should try to see if do they have access to that on the Slack, to that PDF of the lecture now, or not yet?
They have the access to the homework now. Yeah.
Okay. I think the quantities are defined there too. So
yeah, I also already posted the exercise to the Slack. Yeah.
Right.
They should be able to see it.
Because it suddenly occurred to me that in order to do this exercise with the symmetric binary channel, you need to know the definition of the mutual information. But I think it's there in the homework also.
Yeah. Let participants choose rooms. Let's try it. I create 4 breakout room, 1, 2, 3, 4. So you can open all rooms. Yes. So you can go to any room you like.
And even if the outcome is that you guys are unclear on how to solve that problem, then come back and tell me, because that sort of helps me to gauge what I'm doing and whether I'm going too fast and so on.
Right, right.
I have a further procedural suggestion, Chuan. I think
No one
everybody's
is going, it seems.
exactly.
Oh, there's one person going to one room. Okay.
Yeah, no one will go. So what you should do?
Random assignment, right?
Yeah, Zoom has a random assignment thing. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
These things are much easier in person.
Yeah.
So I will also try to
Should we turn off the recording during this time? Because otherwise there's going to be this gigantic gap.
yeah, we can turn off the recording for a moment. Let me